think we're just going to get started with the students we have so far. So I do see that we have some new students in today's class, so I think we'll just get started first by introducing this class. My name is David, and I'll be the kind of your teacher. And the point of this class is it's more of a reading group class, and in this class, it's less so focused on things like public speaking or debate, but more so just to give you guys opportunities to practice having discussions and questioning various issues, world topics and issues that we see in society today. So this is going to be a really good opportunity for you guys to be able to think critically and be able to apply your research and thinking skills into a wide variety of different topics. So that's the purpose of this class. And yeah, so in the past few classes, we've already done a lot of interesting different topics. We've talked about war and conflict, and last class was technology. Today, we're just going to jump into our topic for discussion for this class this week, which is the environment and climate change. Okay, so again, if you're new to the class, this is your first class, I mean, the format's going to be maybe a bit different from what you expect, but we're just going to go along with it. And I think you guys should be able to pick up on it pretty easily as we go through it. So the first thing we'll start off with on this topic is just a short discussion, just to kind of frame our understanding about the environment. So broadly, why do you guys think that learning or talking about the environment matters? Why is it important? So we'll get some volunteers to start us off. Anyone want to volunteer to answer?
I guess. Wait, can you? Yeah. I guess because uh, like there's a fact about climate change, and because it would destroy the environment, which would then affect us because uh, our food prices would go up, the house prices we need to build would go up because wood would be more expensive, and just in general, it would ruin materials.
Yeah, it's very good, Carl. Also, I can kind of hear you, just like almost, but your microphone is still very, very quiet. So, you might want to check on like the microphone that you're using and whether it can actually pick up what you're saying. But it's a really great answer. So yeah, just in case anyone wasn't able to or was having trouble hearing, right? Carl basically told us that it's important to care about the environment because, there are a lot of things that we need from the environment, right? Like natural resources and building materials and these sorts of things. If, we don't take care of the environment and these become more scarce, then it's going to be more expensive for us to get these things that we really need for our life. That's a great answer. Does anyone else want to add to that? Or they have a different reason? Anyone
Um,
else?
we live in the environment, so we should care about what happens in the environment.
Yeah, for sure. Can you think of any examples of how the environment affects us? How do we interact with the environment or anyone else? This is a question for everyone. What are some of the ways in which we interact with the environment? Okay, what I'll do is like sometimes if there's not enough volunteers, I'll just sometimes pick on someone at random. If you really can't think of an answer, you can feel free to pass and we'll try to come back to you, but just to make sure everyone has a chance to participate, right? So, Maya, let's hear from you. What do you think?
Um, what was the question again?
yeah, so like what are some examples? Can you think of some examples like in your life or just in general of how we interact with the environment, like us as humans?
Or like to farm and like get food.
Yeah, so how does that make us interact with the environment?
We have to like reserve spaces in our land in order to have enough like farmland.
Yeah, for sure. Good. Let's hear from one more person. What are some other ways in which we interact with the environment? Emma, what do you think?
We breathe air.
Okay, we breathe. Yeah, yeah, this is good. Like this kind of, yeah. Do you have something to add? No, okay. Yeah, so I guess like you guys might think like, oh, this is obvious, right? But it's actually a really good point because if we think about like the quality of air and why it's really important for us to be able to have access to breathing clean, right, non-polluted air. And so like, many parts of the world where maybe pollution is a lot worse than here in Canada, not a lot of people can actually breathe the same like level of quality of clean air that we can. So this is actually really important because it can affect, our physical health, right, if we're breathing like dirty air all the time. So this is important to think about. Yeah. So, I think we all had some really good answers here. You guys clearly understand that the environment's a really big part of our lives for society as a whole. Here's some other pictures you guys that kind of like illustrate the importance of the environment and how we really rely and depend on the environment as well, right? Like this wildfire here, right? Burning down forests that can have a really big impact on our physical health, our safety, the resources that we're able to get. Another example are floods, right? The way that the world is changing, these floods have become much more common in the modern day, right? And this is obviously affecting the ways which we live. So this is also a really important kind of effect for us to consider. And the destruction that the environment can have when, we're not really taking care of the environment, we're kind of mistreating it. And the consequences of that on us are also, very, very severe, very, very significant. So I hope this just goes to, first of all, illustrate to us why we should care about this issue, right? Why this is a really, really big worldwide and global issue as well, because, the environment affects you wherever you live, regardless if you live in a coastal city, mountains, or in a city center, right? It can affect a lot of people in many different ways. All right, well, let's move on. Andrew, I see you've joined. So today's topic is we're just talking about environment and the climate change. So we're going to now jump into a bit of a different discussion. We're going to talk about, well, obviously, since this is such a big issue, there's been a lot of climate news going on recently, right? So some very, very important, significant climate events. What are some, can you guys think of any of these major kind of climate events that you've seen or heard about on the news recently?
Various forest fires in like Quebec and Hawaii, I think.
Yeah, very good, Lucas. Anyone else? You guys can also type in the chat if you don't want to unmute. I will like sometimes volunteer you guys to unmute, but you can also type in the chat if you feel. Okay, let's hear from Annie. What is the piece? Have you seen any pieces of climate change news related recently?
Um, I guess there's like global warming.
like any specific events that's been caused by global warming that you've heard of recently?
Not really. I don't really look at the news.
Okay, fair enough. Can you think of some potential effects or some potential events that have been caused by global warming?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't really hear you.
Yeah, sorry. So, like even if you haven't read in the news, can you think of any potential events that have been caused by global warming? Are you able to hear me still, Annie?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, no worries. Maybe we can come back to you later in the discussion. Let's hear from one more person. Well, what's another like, you know, key piece of events or key event that you've heard regarding to climate recently? Yeah, melting ice caps. Yeah, Emma, do you want to expand on what you mean there?
Recently, because of climate change, ice has been melting and sea levels are rising.
Yeah, for sure. And we can talk about all the variety of different consequences to the environment as a result of that. Andrew, do you want to talk about Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement? What is that? What is the Paris Agreement?
Paris Agreement is environmental agreement signed in Paris. I'm not too sure what it's about, but it's very important.
Hmm. Yeah, very good. So, it's an environmental agreement signed by a bunch of different nations around the world, pledging to, in the future, keep the global temperature increase below a certain level, right? So they're setting a target of, you know, this is the most we want global warming to to affect us, right? And so we're going to pledge to reduce like our pollution, our emissions, so that global warming does not get worse than that target. And so when Trump was president, obviously he pulled the United States, which is one of the biggest producers of emissions, out of that agreement. Um, and so that was basically signaling to the rest of the world, like, hey, America's not going to, do their part to really, try to combat the climate change as much. And then Carl says there are a lot of wildfires. Yeah. So this is good. And we can talk about wildfires as well, but obviously, as you saw from the picture there, we've already talked about the significance of that, and that's affected a lot of people's lives. So it's really good though. I like your guys' answers. The fact that you know about things like the Paris Agreement already. This is shows that you guys know your stuff. Okay, so there's a few things we're going to talk about. Kind of have discussions, guide our discussions about the environment. So the planet, the causes of climate change, history, effects, and solutions. The last two are pretty important to think about, right? Because we want to think critically about this issue. We don't just want to know what happened, but more so, how does this, affect people around the world, and what can we do individually and also, as a society to try to fight against this really, really bad thing of climate change. So we'll start with planet. Right? Oops. Okay. Um, And so the first thing to understand is kind of like, well, why the environment is important, and it ultimately comes back to the question that, like, the environment and the earth itself is supporting our lives, right? That's because, our planet has a lot of key features that enable us to live, right? Water, we have a good balance of gases. Oxygen, we have a good enough temperature range so that we're not like frozen to death or like burning to death. That mainly comes from our atmosphere, which is basically this layer of gases around our Earth that helps to allow us to, create a suitable condition for us to live in. So without this atmosphere, some really, really bad things would happen to the Earth, but it basically protects us and allows us to stay alive, basically. And then I'm sure you guys have all probably learned this in your science classes already, right? One part of the atmosphere that is really, really important is the ozone layer, right? And so the ozone layer basically protects us from really, really harmful radiation, right, from the sun, which can cause really bad things to humans that are exposed to it, right? Things like cancer, but also like the sunlight is also like obviously that can be really hot, and that can heat up our planet, right? But the ozone layer helps to kind of protect from that. Um, so this is a bit of an overview on our planet, and this is important because it helps to explain what kind of the main causes of climate change are. Again, I'm sure if you guys took science class, you would know this. But I guess before we get into diving into the actual explanations, can you guys think of some of like what are the primary causes of climate change? What do you think those may be? Factories, airplanes, cars. Yeah, it's good, Andrew. If I were to ask you to kind of like group all of those factors into one single reason, what would it be?
Energy, making energy.
Okay, good. I think that's a good start. So, what type of energy are we specifically talking about that's really unsustainable?
Fossil
the
fuel.
Excellent. Yeah, fossil fuels, right? And this is because fossil fuels, when you burn them, they produce a lot of emissions, which are really harmful gases. And I see someone's already kind of told, actually, multiple people have already told me, right? But these create what are known as greenhouse gases. So things like carbon dioxide. Okay. And so I'm going to put pollution here. But, and the really bad thing about does anyone know why greenhouse gases are really bad and why that changes our climate when we produce so much greenhouse gases?
They make the earth warmer.
Exactly. Yeah. And I see ML also, you mentioned the same thing, raising the temperature of the earth, right? And so Earth, and this is a phenomenon that we all kind of know as global warming. So yeah, good. You guys have a fundamental understanding of this. Um, and so that's one of the reasons, one of the main kind of driving forces behind climate change, right? But climate change doesn't just include global warming. I mean, of course, making the atmosphere of the Earth warmer does change our climate. There are also other factors. I think one thing someone else mentioned is pollution. Does anyone know, like, what types of pollution there are and how that affects our climate?
Air, water, light, and
Really
land.
good at land pollution. Good.
Sound pollution.
Sorry, can you say that again, Lucas?
Sound pollution.
Sound pollution is good. Yeah. And how do these different types of pollution contribute to climate change? How do they change our climate? I'll give you guys a hint. I think it has to do with like these two ones primarily, right? I mean, think about it, air pollution and water pollution.
Air is greenhouse gases. Water is like plastic and things like that, either dissolve or large chunks of it floating around.
Yeah. I'll also say like chemicals, so things like fertilizers that get washed into like rivers and oceans contributes to water pollution as well. And then air is like harmful. Yeah, and so I think one effect here could definitely from water pollution is the death of sea life, right? And then probably the other thing is that like when you have water and air pollution, right, and you have these really harmful particles in these sorts of places, right? What does that do to the climate? Well, it makes the environment a lot more toxic and a lot less good to live in, right? So also in that case, it affects humans as well. So not just animals or the ecosystem, but also us as a whole. Um, so for sure, I would say Okay, this is really good, guys. We have some really great ideas here. So we've kind of already talked about the whole greenhouse gases thing, but just so you guys know, right? Like the reason why greenhouse gases increase temperature is that they trap the heat that the sun kind of reflects onto the earth. So instead of it, most of the rays of the sun bouncing off of the earth and dissipating into space, greenhouse gases form this like layer that traps and bounces the heat back onto Earth. That obviously makes the Earth hotter, and it's not really good, right? So I think we kind of already talked about this, right? But what are some reasons why do we produce so much greenhouse gases? Like, what's driving us to try more and more of them?
More energy.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very cheap and people like cheap things.
Yeah, this is good to add, right, Andrew? Because, there are other ways we can produce energy, but burning fossil fuels is the cheapest and the easiest way, which is why so many people, companies use it as well. Very cheap, yeah. Animal farms is also a good one, Maya. And so obviously the case here is like certain animals that we farm, they produce greenhouse gases. So cows, for example, they produce methane, and that's a really bad greenhouse gas as well. What are some other reasons we produce greenhouse gases? Ding. I think generally you can also talk about like production of goods and services. So like factories and things, they produce a lot of air pollution, right? And that goes into greenhouse gases. When we drive cars and things like that, also create a lot of greenhouse gases, the emissions from the exhaust. So I think there are many ways that we produce them, but it really just goes back to this key idea of, creating, using up a lot of energy, right, for the things that we do on it in our daily lives. All right. Now, the other thing that really contributes to climate change is the use of aerosols, which we talked about earlier, right? Aerosols. And if you guys don't know, basically, these are just chemical substances that we use for a variety of things, from farming to like household use. But these like chemical substances that we oftentimes will spray, we use to spray in things, that gets into the air and that creates chemical reactions that destroy the ozone layer, like you can see in this diagram. And that's really, really bad because we talked about why the ozone layer is really important to protect us from the harmful rays of the sun. We don't need to go too much into detail as to what those are, but the final thing then we'll talk about is just deforestation. Okay, so does anyone know, can anyone define what deforestation is? What does that term mean?
Cutting down a lot of forests to either get the land or harvest the material from the tree.
Yeah, that's very good, Andrew. So cutting down of trees, uh, either to clear up more land or to get the materials, right? And then does anyone know why deforestation is really, really harmful? I think the diagram here gives you a big hint, but why do you guys think deforestation is really bad? Okay, let's see. Erosion. Carl, can you explain that a bit more? What do
Uh,
you mean by erosion?
when like wood isn't cut correctly, like for example, if people use this clear cutting method, which just cuts a big section of wood, then something called erosion will happen, which will destroy the ground and which will then in general just destroy the place around it, causing new trees not to grow, which will affect the CO2, which shown in the picture. More trees gives more CO2, less trees, they don't produce CO2 because they can't perform. I guess I'm not sure if it's right, but photosynthesis.
Yeah, So that's really good. I think also like what you're getting at with soil erosion is that like trees, they store a lot of nutrients in their roots, right? And so obviously if you cut them down, you kill off the trees, well, the nutrients are no longer there for the soil, and that's really bad for the soil. And that causes it to erode. I think you're also getting at the right idea there with like, it prevents them from growing, more trees in the future in those same areas. But predominantly, I think there's also one really big important reason for why deforestation is bad. And there's a really big hint in the image as I said. So what do you guys think that reason could possibly be?
Trees and forests absorb a lot of carbon dioxide. And if you remove all of them, then there's a lot less plants to consume the carbon dioxide.
Yeah, exactly, Maya. So that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. And we discussed earlier how carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So the less carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere is good, right? Because that means that we're not going to be trapping as much heat inside uh, within the earth. But as soon as you cut down those trees, you kill them off. Well, not only do they stop absorbing in CO2, but all of the carbon dioxide that they had stored in there previously now gets released back into the air. And that obviously means global warming gets worse. So I think Andrew kind of already answered this for us, so I'm not going to spend too much time, right? But two main reasons we cut down trees. One, either for the resource of the wood itself, but two, and this is much more common, is that we cut down trees because we need land for whatever it is that we're trying to develop, whether it's a factory or a business or a city or a farm, right? So sometimes, we cut down those trees because we need more space to build whatever it is we as humans want to build. Okay, and then this is the slide about aerosols that we briefly touched on, but we're not going to get too much into that because this is more of a more complex topic. Okay, cool. The next thing we'll briefly discuss is to talk about the history of climate change. Um, and to provide some important context, climate change hasn't always been something that's necessarily 100% caused by humans, right? Temperature fluctuations, the change in temperature within the Earth, has always had a really big range. It's varied a lot over the hundreds of millions of years Earth has existed. And this kind of graph shows you that, right? In some time periods, it was a lot hotter relatively, in some time periods, it's a lot colder. But, recently, in the past, I would say like 500, 400, 500 years, we have started to see an artificial change in the global temperature. And I'm sure we all know this is caused by humans, right? Started with the Industrial Revolution, um, which is like the period of time in which we started being able to produce a lot more things, a lot faster, at a lot bigger scales, and we need to use a lot more energy to make those things, right? That really created a lot more of those bad greenhouse gases that then raised the Earth's temperature to be really, really a lot higher. And so this you can see in the graph, you see what the natural warming and cooling trend is supposed to look like, but then what we actually observe, um, you know, suggests to us that there is a human element. There's human element to why the temperature has gone up so much more than we've expected, right? And one really interesting trend that we've seen more recently is kind of developing countries starting to use more fossil fuels to create their energy. And so now, in the past, it used to be like more developed countries like the United States, like Europe, who oftentimes would contribute a lot of emissions, but more and more so, it's actually becoming these developing countries like China or India or South Africa who are now consuming this fossil fuel and contributing to the climate change. So one question that I want to kind of pose to all of you guys is, you guys think that developing countries deserve their share of fossil fuels that they get to use, right? Because in the past, the Western countries, like more developed countries, able to use fossil fuels, but nowadays, there's been a lot more criticism on countries like China for using so much fossil fuels. Do you think we're justified in telling them to use less, or do they also deserve to use an equal amount of fossil fuels as those more developed countries used in the past? What do we think about that? Yeah. Let's hear from Emma. What do you think, Emma?
Yes, I think developing countries do deserve their share of fossil fuels because they might be using that to improve their like quality of life in like within their country.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's a good perspective to look at it from. Anyone else agree with that or have a different perspective?
I think yes as well. But they need to, like, the US and Canada and all those countries, they did the same thing, just a lot like before. So now, like, those countries turn.
Yeah, so now those countries should also get to benefit from that as well. And Carl also agrees and says yes. What about the other perspective? Does anyone think that no, they don't actually deserve their share of fossil fuels? That we should tell them, hey, even though these bigger countries, like the United States, they produced a lot of pollution in the past, it's actually it's not okay for China and India and these other countries to now still be so reliant on fossil fuels. Does anyone have an opinion supporting that? Okay, really, no one. Well, um, I mean, I can kind of just briefly talk about the other perspective. I think basically the idea that climate change and global warming is a global issue, right? It's kind of a worldwide issue. We need to kind of put this disagreement about whether they deserve their share off to one side and focus on, well, we should focus on reducing fossil fuel usage to prevent climate change for the world as a whole. So that's kind of the other kind of perspective and why it's actually more worthwhile to encourage these countries to not get their share of fossil fuels. But yeah, again, um, this chart kind of tells the story that we were talking about earlier. The blue area here is kind of like the amount of fossil fuel used by these developed countries. So in the 20th century, for example, you can see mostly blue, right? But then as you kind of got onto the 21st century, way over here, if you look at that, right? Now the area is far more dominated by the orange, right? And so that was the rest of the world. And so that's the trend that I was kind of talking about earlier. That's why it's like really important, right? All right, great. I think that we're now going to go into the effects of climate change. I mentioned this was quite important to think about how the environment and the climate change affects different people across all walks of life. So first thing we'll talk about global warming. I think already quite self-explanatory how this works and what it is. And you'll often hear about the effects of global warming on like the ice sheet in like the Arctic or the Antarctic and how this is causing ice to melt and to break. But one really key effect that you might not have considered from that and from all that melting ice is the effects on the ocean currents, right? Because when ice melts, this ice that melts is not salty at all. And so when it gets combined with the seawater that is salty, it kind of changes the way the density or like the saltiness of the seawater. And that really has a big effect on ocean currents, right? So the way in which the water flows all across different oceans across the world. This affects a lot of things. It can affect the wildlife, the fish and other ocean life that are living in those oceans. And that obviously has a really significant effect on our environment, our wildlife. Um, there are also a lot of human effects, and these are kind of the ones you probably seen on the news that we discussed earlier, right? Things like natural disasters get much more common with climate change because as the climate gets affected by pollution and by global warming, it becomes far more unpredictable. That makes it far more likely for these uncommon, very dangerous events to occur, things like earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, or tornadoes. Another one is rising sea levels. It's kind of self-explanatory. But as ice melts because of global warming, this raises the sea level across the world, and it's potentially do things like flood cities and homes. And then finally, droughts. As the global temperature increases in some areas of the world, right, which are closer to the equator, it will become a lot hotter. The climate will be a lot hotter, and that will make it really difficult for you to grow any sort of food, and that's bad because we need food to kind of survive, right? So I kind of briefly outlined these three types of effects of climate change. Let's go into more detail and talk about some of the possible harms that can result as that come from each of these. So anyone who wants to volunteer, just give me one possible harm for one of uh, these three effects of climate change.
People dying.
For sure. I think this is something we could probably put in all three of them actually. This is a very, very common harm. Anything else? Anyone else?
Droughts make it so that animals die and like crop conditions suck. So I guess it affects the economy because of the conditions. They can't grow.
Sea level rising produces methane when all the above water plants start dying.
Really good. Yeah. Lucas, I think you also had something.
Um, uh, like Australia them have a lot of habitat loss.
Sorry. So yeah, which one does that relate to?
Probably natural disasters or sea levels.
Yeah, for sure. I think both of those could be good. Anyone else have anything? Oh, I see something in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, we already have deaths for all three of those. Anyone else?
All of these things affect the economy.
Yeah, for sure. I would say there's some economic loss for natural disasters that can, destroy buildings, it can destroy entire cities, and it costs a lot for the government to rebuild, right? But also, people who lose their homes there, where are they going to live now, right? They're going to be poor. They're going to have to spend a lot of money to rebuild their lives. So, for sure, the economic loss is actually a really, really important factor there. So I'm glad you brought it up. Cool. I mean, if anyone else has any ideas, put in the chat. Um, but yeah, I really like what you guys talked about here. Um, everyone kind of, I think the first instinct was to talk about your health, right? And diet. And obviously this is like the most important and significant harm, right? Because climate change does bring a lot of really negative health effects, right? Um, for example, droughts make it easier for the spread of diseases. things like malaria, which are carried by mosquitoes, right? Poverty is also another really big factor. So like we said, if your house gets flooded, your city gets flooded, well, you're gonna lose a lot of money. You're gonna be really, really poor. This is generally really, really bad for people. Other effects. With droughts come with food shortages, which, as we said, people rely on food. You need food to live. So if farmers aren't able to grow enough crops because they keep dying off, then food prices are either going to get really high or, some people are not going to be able to afford the food. So there's really big concerns there. And the final thing is migration, right? So, when your home kind of gets destroyed, gets flooded, or it gets wrecked by a tornado, well, where are you going to go, right? And this creates a really big humanitarian crisis in that now you have a lot of refugees, and we call these environmental refugees. And then have to go to other countries to seek shelter, right, from the effects of the environment. This creates also a really massive, human rights issues as well. So cool. I guess all of this is just to illustrate that the effects of climate change are really, really destructive. I know that, maybe for us who live in Canada, we're very fortunate to not experience the worst kind of outcomes. But if you think about people who are living in Asia or in Africa or South America that are far closer to many of these possible harms, it can really, really affect and negatively impact their lives, right? And completely turn their lives around. And so I guess the conclusion here that we're trying to get at is that the effects of climate change are really, really important and definitely not something for us to just kind of ignore or scoff at. Great. Well, this brings us to our final point of discussion, which are kind of the solutions, right? And again, the whole point of getting us to talk about this is to think about, there is this really, really big daunting issue in the world with climate change. How can we make this better? Or how can we at least find some sort of solution to the problem? The first thing I think we should talk about, I want you guys to discuss is whose responsibility do you think it is to tackle climate change? Is it more individuals' responsibility, or is it kind of like the government's or some other large institution or company's responsibility to tackle climate change? So let's hear from you guys. What do you guys think? Well, actually, here, let's start with this. Who thinks individuals? Someone who thinks individuals. Unmute and tell me why you think individuals.
I think everyone has a responsibility to think about what their actions have on, what effects their action has on the environment.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point, Maya. Anyone else? Anyone else who thinks individuals? No one else? Well, here's another perspective that I think is quite important, that justifies individuals' responsibility, right? If you think about climate change as a problem, right, being something like a group project you're doing at school, right? You can't really do well on the group project at school if not everyone is contributing, right? If you have a few members who are slacking off, not really doing the work, you might get some of your group project done, but it's going to turn out really, really bad, right? You're going to get a bad mark. And so I think climate change is really similar to that in that you can argue you need everyone to work together. There needs to be some sort of collective action in order for us to solve this properly, right? If some people stop driving cars and walk or take public transit to school, while other people are still driving cars and increasing pollution, you're not really going to be able to sustainably address climate change. So collective action is a really big reason why people argue, it can be individuals' responsibility. But let's move on to government then. Who thinks it should be the government's responsibility to tackle climate change? Someone just unmute and tell me why.
I think the government should be responsible because uh, they can control what kind of laws and regulations that companies have to follow, and also they have the power to change these kind of things, and they also take taxes from like individuals and such, so they should put that to good use.
Oh, really good points. Yeah. Andrew?
They have most of the power in this situation. They have to, as he said, they have to make laws and stuff. Um, at, right now, it's mostly like government or like companies making all the pollution or most of the pollution. Uh, even for garbage and stuff, factories make like I forgot how much exactly, but it's at least 10 times the amount that civilians make. I'm not sure if it's 10 times. I think it's
Yeah, I think even if, it's not exactly 10 times, I think this is definitely true, right? When you think about it, they need to produce, like, they produce so much more things than the average person. Like, a factory has to use fossil fuels to manufacture, like, thousands of items that they're going to sell, right? Whereas we as individuals, we might only use enough energy or enough emissions to, like, at most turn on the lights in our room or something like that, right? Or cook food in our kitchen. So for sure, because they have a greater burden, they produce more emissions, they should also have a greater responsibility. So I like all of your points here. I think there can be arguments made for both individuals and governments both working together to also tackle climate change. That's very good. Oh, okay. Remember those two causes we talked about earlier as to how they contribute to climate change, right? The biggest ones were greenhouse gases, right? So things like air pollution, and also deforestation. So given that we agree that these are really, really bad causes for climate change, what can we do to address each of them? You guys think about, you can think about creative solutions to these kinds of issues. What do you guys think we should do? Yeah, I'm just gonna call on someone. Annie, what do you think? What do you think we should do?
Um, I mean, we could like for deforestation, um,
Wasn't really able to hear you. Can you repeat what you said?
actually no, greenhouse gases. I mean, we could like I guess eat less animal.
Yeah, very good. How would that reduce greenhouse gases?
Because like when you like I guess kill the animals, a lot of like I think CO2 emissions go into like the atmosphere, like and animals like produce methane and stuff.
For sure. So both like farming and feeding the animals, and then also killing them produces a lot of emissions. And if we can reduce that, that'd be good for the environment. Any other ideas?
Maybe using less energy, like for example, turning off the lights in your house when you leave or aren't using it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great idea. Anyone else have any ideas?
I think for deforestation, something that governments can do is like figure out how to use their land more effectively so that they don't have to like cut down a lot of trees and stuff.
Yeah, this is really good. So, one reason, like in Canada, we deforest a lot of trees. It's actually urban sprawl. So when we want to build more houses and things like that, to develop more houses, we build outwards. And we have to cut down trees in order to make space for all those massive houses. But we just use our land more effectively, actually, and reduce the size of you know, the houses that we build. You can actually fit a lot more people. We don't have to, destroy so many trees. So I don't know if you guys have heard recently, but there's this like very recent news in Ontario, right? That the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, wanted to kind of develop and kind of like cut down some trees in the green belt, which is like this protected area of forest in Ontario, and build a lot of houses there. And that got a lot of backlash. So it was very unpopular with the citizens. So that's just something to think about. But yeah, that's a good, great point. Yeah, Carlson, yep, yep. Anyone else have any ideas to combat deforestation?
Maybe recycle like paper and wood and stuff to use less trees.
Good. Yeah. What about like, we've talked a lot about reducing, cutting down more trees. Is there anything we can do kind of in the opposite direction to, you know, increase the supply?
Plant more trees.
Yeah, plant more, just simply plant more trees. I kind of gave you guys a really big hint there, right? But another strategy a lot of people are doing nowadays is realizing plant more trees, right? And that takes a lot of time, but this is a long-term investment that is going to be able to benefit all of humanity, right? In the future, if we plant more trees and we can have more, you can absorb more of the carbon dioxide. Eat less. Um, how would that help with deforestation?
Currently, most of deforestation is near the tropics, so people can get like farmland and stuff they because that's how they can get a better economy. So if we eat less, and most of farming, most of farmland is for meat, and because it's very inefficient to eat meat, and eating plants is like much more efficient.
Yeah, excellent, Andrew. So, like we talked about earlier, some of the main reasons for why we deforest is one, for the resources, but two, more importantly, to cut down, use that space for things like farmland. And so obviously if we eat less meat, then we can reduce the need for all that farmland. And so, companies won't cut down as many trees to build that farmland, right? This is an excellent point. So, what are countries doing, right? We talked about individuals and governments. What about like different nations as a whole? Well, I think earlier someone alluded to the Paris Climate Agreement, and that's just one way in which companies around the world, or sorry, not countries around the world, are working together to cooperate and to coordinate how they can reduce their greenhouse gas usage. So one very, very recent example of this is the climate summit, the COP27 climate summit, which is held every year. And this is an organization of, I guess you can pretty much tell, 27 countries that kind of work together um, and kind of come together once per year to see how each of their countries can cut down on their climate, on their emissions and things like that, right? So that's just one way in which, sorry, they meet together and come up with ideas to combat climate change. What other ways, or what should countries do other than that to work together to fight climate change? Other things should they do? Can and should they do? So again, feel free to be creative with your ideas, because I think you guys have a lot of good ideas, and these are probably some ideas that countries do actually do in the real world.
Start investing in like renewable sources of energy.
Excellent. Yeah, that's something we're definitely seeing countries work towards. What else?
make stricter laws about releasing pollution.
Right, for sure. And maybe even like internationally, they can sign different agreements. And these agreements basically hold them accountable to meeting some of those targets that we talked about earlier, right, with the Paris Climate Accord. Um, So for sure that as well. What about helping people who have been affected by the harms of climate change? How can countries work together to provide aid to those sorts of countries or to those people?
Give money.
So they need monetary aid, for sure. Is there any other ideas that you guys have? All right, cool. Well, yeah, these are some definitely some things that countries are currently doing right now, actually working together to get that done to fight against climate change. So you guys, I think you guys are right on the mark for this actually. And then we were gonna do an activity where I just get you guys to research a technology that is being developed to address climate change. Obviously, we're running really low on time, so we're not going to be able to do that. And I guess the final thing is just something for you guys to consider as we wrap up today's class. Do we have a moral responsibility to address climate change, right? So obviously, maybe, we're all pretty young. We might live for another like 70, 80 years. In 70 and 80 years, maybe climate change will not, completely destroy the world. It'll have really big impacts on people, but it won't completely, result in the end of our lives. Should we then care about, people who are in the next few generations, right? And do we have a responsibility to protect the earth and make sure that climate change doesn't destroy our world so that in those future generations, our children, our grandchildren, so that they can live better lives? So this is an important question, I think, for us to consider. I'm not going to get you guys to answer it just because we're running out of time, but again, it's these types of questions that we really should be trying to work to ask ourselves because they're really, really important. Okay, cool. I'll just leave you on a final thought. How can we as individuals help combat climate change? Um, but yeah, other than that, I hope this has been a helpful kind of class. And you guys have been great participating in our discussions today, so thank you for that. If you enjoyed this class, hope to see you guys next class. If you're new here, where we'll be discussing another interesting, relevant topic. Okay, does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments? If not, you guys are free to go.
What's next
Bye. Sorry?
topic? What's next class's topic?
What's next class's topic? Give me a second. That's a good question, actually. Let me just check what I have planned. I think we're going to talk about work and labor, so it'll be a very interesting topic, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.